cold winter silence hangs over Berlin on December 11, 1941. Inside the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler prepares to address the German nation. The world is still absorbing the shock of Pearl Harbor, but Hitler is about to deliver an even more puzzling blow to global stability. His decision will change the fate of millions. His voice rises as he declares war on the United States, a country far larger, richer, and more industrially powerful than his own. And for a moment, even his closest officers wonder, what is he doing? This is the declaration that historians still debate, a moment that defied military logic and baffled many of Hitler's own allies. Germany was already bleeding on the Eastern Front, locked in a brutal struggle with the Soviet Union. British resistance continued from the air and sea. And now, Hitler was choosing to awaken the largest industrial giant on Earth. Why? Some believed Hitler felt cornered. Others believed he felt invincible. But beneath the speeches and propaganda, one truth becomes clear. This decision was deeply personal. Hitler's hatred for Roosevelt and his fear of American influence pushed him into a war he didn't need and couldn't win. As one German diplomat later recalled, logic had nothing to do with it. Before we dive deeper, imagine the scene from the perspective of the world watching. The United States had not declared war on Germany. The American people were still grieving Pearl Harbor, angry at Japan, and rallying toward the Pacific. No one expected Europe to ignite overnight. And yet, within 4 days of the attack, Hitler forced America into a global war on two fronts. A micro-hook emerges. Why did Hitler strike first when he didn't have to? The answer isn't simple. It lies somewhere between ideology, pride, paranoia, and catastrophic miscalculation. Hitler believed the United States lacked the will to fight a long war. He believed American diversity was a weakness, not a strength. He believed that distance across the Atlantic meant something in the age of submarines and modern warfare. And he believed that fate had aligned Germany and Japan as unstoppable partners. But as this chapter unfolds, the question becomes more haunting. Did Hitler truly understand what he was provoking? Or did he underestimate the United States the same way he underestimated the Soviet Union? His decision would set off a chain reaction that reshaped the world. Yet in that moment, he spoke with total confidence. Hitler framed the declaration as a defensive act, accusing the United States of open aggression in the Atlantic. In truth, his navy had been losing the shadow war against American escorts for months. But rather than pull back, he leaned into confrontation. This wasn't strategy. This was momentum without foresight. And momentum, in wartime, can be deadly. Here's where the story sharpens. Hitler believed Japan would return the favor by attacking the Soviet Union from the east. In his mind, this was a masterstroke. Germany would no longer fight alone in the snow and mud of the Eastern Front, but Japan had no intention of opening that front. Hitler's belief wasn't based on intelligence, it was based on assumption. And assumptions in global war are dangerous. As he spoke to the Reichstag, the room erupted in applause. To the outside world, it looked like confidence. Inside his own government, it looked like recklessness. One general later wrote, "We cheered because we had to, not because we understood." That single sentence captures the uneasy truth behind the curtain of Nazi power. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Roosevelt stood stunned. The United States had expected a long conflict with Japan. But a war with Germany only days after the Pacific disaster shifted America's military trajectory instantly. Factories that were preparing for partial mobilization suddenly switched to full war footing. Hitler had done the one thing Roosevelt struggled to do: unify the American people. How could one speech, delivered thousands of miles away, unleash the largest industrial mobilization in human history? This chapter doesn't answer that yet, but it sets the stage. Hitler's declaration did not just open a new front. It awakened a nation that had been hesitant, divided, and unsure until that moment. His miscalculation became America's rallying cry. But let's return to the question at the heart of this episode. Why? Why declare war on a superpower before it fully realizes its own strength? Why antagonize a country capable of producing more planes, tanks, ships, and ammunition than the entire Axis combined? Some historians argue that Hitler believed war with America was inevitable, so striking first made him appear decisive. Others suggest that ideological blindness convinced him democracy would collapse under pressure. Both theories carry weight, but neither explains the emotional tone in his speech. He wasn't merely announcing a conflict. He was indulging a long-held resentment. Roosevelt's public criticism of Nazism infuriated Hitler. American support for Britain enraged him. And the idea of a culturally diverse nation rising to challenge his racial empire contradicted everything he believed. His worldview demanded confrontation. This chapter reveals the chilling truth that ideology can override strategy. Hitler's decision wasn't purely military or political, it was psychological. He saw the world not as it was, but as he believed it should be. And in that distorted vision, he imagined a quick German victory before American forces could mobilize. But as we know, that vision would collide with reality in devastating ways. As the echoes of the Reichstag applause fade, the camera widens to show Europe aflame, the Eastern Front frozen in crisis, and American war factories stirring to life. The stage is no longer set for a regional conflict. The world is now locked into total war. What if Hitler had paused? What if he had chosen restraint instead of escalation? And yet, he didn't. The die was cast. This chapter closes with a lingering question that will guide the entire documentary. Was Hitler's declaration of war the moment Nazi Germany sealed its own fate? Or was it merely the last spark in a fire that had been burning for years? The answer lies in what comes next when we explore how tension, misjudgment, and ambition pushed Europe and America into unavoidable confrontation. Sometimes the most destructive decisions in history aren't forced, they're chosen. The world of the late 1930s was a powder keg waiting for the right spark, and everyone sensed it, even if they hoped otherwise. Across continents, political tensions, economic desperation, and rising nationalism created an atmosphere thick with uncertainty. This was not a world at peace. This was a world balancing on the edge of something far larger than anyone wanted to admit. Europe was the first region to show the cracks. Hitler's Germany had rearmed at lightning speed, defying the Treaty of Versailles with shocking boldness. Each move Rhineland, Austria, Czechoslovakia pushed the boundaries of what the world would tolerate. And every time, the lack of a strong response reinforced one dangerous belief inside Berlin. No one would dare stop them. A micro-hook forms here. What happens when unchecked ambition meets global hesitation? Meanwhile, in Britain and France, fear and exhaustion shaped foreign policy more than strength did. The trauma of World War I still lingered, and leaders clung desperately to diplomacy, hoping negotiation could contain a regime that had no interest in compromise. Their attempts at peace only encouraged Hitler further. Europe was drifting toward a storm, yet so many still believed it could be avoided. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched events unfold with a mix of concern and distance. Americans were recovering from the Great Depression, skeptical of foreign entanglements, and determined not to repeat the sacrifices of World War I. Isolationism wasn't just a political stance, it was a national instinct. Many believed the oceans were still wide enough to protect them. President Roosevelt, however, saw danger approaching. He understood that Nazi Germany's expansion threatened global stability, even if the American public wasn't ready to hear it. He moved carefully, speaking in measured tones while quietly preparing the country for a world that might soon demand more than speeches. Still, he had to tread lightly. One wrong step could fracture public support. In Asia, another storm gathered strength. Imperial Japan had launched its own campaign of conquest, sweeping through China and eyeing the Pacific with increasing confidence. Japan's rise added a second axis of instability, one that directly threatened American interests. And while Germany and Japan operated independently at this stage, their ambitions began to align in troubling ways. By 1940, the world resembled a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and shifting strategies. The Axis powers projected confidence, but beneath that confidence lay a dangerous mix of calculation and overreach. The Allied powers, meanwhile, struggled to unify, held back by hesitation, internal politics, and the lingering scars of earlier conflicts. Germany's pact with the Soviet Union shocked the world. Two ideological enemies suddenly stood side by side, carving Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Many observers wondered, was this stability or simply the silence before something far worse? The truth would soon become clear, but for the moment, the world held its breath. In Washington, Roosevelt began pushing Lend-Lease, a program designed to assist Britain without sending American troops into battle. It allowed the United States to supply weapons, aircraft, and ships to nations resisting Axis aggression. Though labeled aid, it was effectively a quiet alignment with Britain against Germany. Hitler noticed. Every convoy crossing the Atlantic carrying food, fuel, tanks, and ammunition felt like a step closer to conflict. Naval skirmishes grew more frequent. Reporters called it the gray zone, a phase where nations were not officially at war, but acted as though war was inevitable. A micro-hook rises naturally here. How long can two nations circle each other before one finally strikes? Inside Berlin, Hitler interpreted American involvement as meddling, even hostility. Each new shipment strengthened his belief that the United States was already an enemy, merely hiding behind technical neutrality. His worldview, shaped by ideology and suspicion, convinced him that democracies were weak and easily divided. That assumption would prove costly. Yet for all the rising tension, diplomacy continued. Ambassadors wrote letters filled with optimism they barely believed. Leaders spoke of peace while preparing for war. And ordinary people across Europe, Asia, and America wondered whether the world was heading toward another catastrophe, or if there was still time to turn back. Understanding this era means understanding how fragile everything had become. Borders, treaties, and promises felt temporary. Every country measured its security against the ambitions of others. And deep down, many knew that small decisions made in faraway capitals could ignite consequences felt around the globe. In Germany, propaganda painted an image of unstoppable strength. Rallies, speeches, and radio broadcasts created the illusion of unity and purpose. But behind the spectacle was a regime racing against time, hoping its opponents would remain divided long enough for its plans to succeed. History would soon show that hope was misplaced. Meanwhile, in the United States, public opinion slowly shifted. Newspaper headlines about European invasion stirred discomfort. Reports of civilian bombings in London created sympathy. The sense of inevitability grew subtle at first, then unmistakable. Americans began to realize that global events could no longer be kept at arm's length. The Atlantic Ocean, once seen as a barrier, was becoming a front line. Submarines hunted beneath the waves. Surveillance increased. Merchant vessels traveled in convoys, escorted by U.S. Navy destroyers. Neutrality was becoming harder to defend with each passing month. By the time 1941 arrived, the world was no longer a collection of isolated crises. It was a single, interconnected conflict stretching from Europe to Asia. Every decision made in Berlin, Tokyo, London, or Washington sent shockwaves across continents. The stage wasn't just set for war, it was primed for explosion. This chapter reminds us that great conflicts rarely begin with a single event. They are the result of countless choices, warnings ignored, and opportunities missed. Leaders on all sides believed they could control the storm. Instead, they were swept up in forces larger than themselves. In this fragile world, one miscalculation could transform regional tension into a global inferno. And that miscalculation would soon arrive not in Europe, but in the Pacific. As the world watched, a single attack would shatter illusions of distance and safety. And once the first domino fell, the rest followed with terrifying speed. The question now becomes, how did a world already on edge react when the spark that no one expected finally ignited the fire? By early 1941, the United States and Nazi Germany were not officially at war, but the truth was far more complicated. Between the Atlantic Ocean's waves and the echoing speeches of world leaders, a quiet hostility had taken shape. It was a conflict without declarations, a rivalry without formal lines drawn. And yet, both nations understood that their paths were converging toward something far more dangerous. On the American side, Roosevelt's administration walked a tightrope. The president believed that Nazi Germany posed a grave threat to global stability, but he also knew that the American public was not ready for another European war. So he supported Britain with supplies, intelligence, and increasing naval protection actions that allowed the United States to help without stepping fully into the fire. To Hitler, however, these moves felt like open provocation. He insisted that the United States was meddling in European affairs, violating neutrality by favoring Britain. His speeches grew sharper, accusing Roosevelt of warmongering. German propaganda portrayed the United States as decadent, divided, and doomed to collapse under pressure. A micro-hook emerges. What happens when two powerful nations convince themselves the other is already an enemy? The Atlantic Ocean became the first stage for rising tension. German U-boats patrolled aggressively, sinking merchant ships and threatening vital supply lines to Britain. American ships, though officially neutral, began escorting convoys to keep them safe. It was a dangerous game of proximity, two militaries moving closer and closer, pretending not to be in conflict while behaving as if they were. Skirmishes soon followed. In September 1941, the USS Greer exchanged fire with a German U-boat. Weeks later, the USS Kearney was torpedoed. Then came the Reuben James, sunk with heavy loss of life. Each incident tightened the invisible knot between the two nations, making it harder for either side to step back. For many Americans, neutrality was starting to feel like a myth. Roosevelt responded with measures that edged the country further into confrontation. He issued shoot-on-sight orders, effectively turning the Atlantic into a hostile zone for German submarines. Officially, it was still a defensive policy. Unofficially, it was something else entirely. It was the United States declaring its intent to protect the Atlantic with force if necessary. In Berlin, these developments sparked alarm. Hitler believed Roosevelt was maneuvering America into the war through the back door. His intelligence reports exaggerated American hostility, feeding into his suspicion that a direct clash was inevitable. To Hitler, the U.S. was already acting like a belligerent, just one waiting for the right excuse. Yet the German high command wasn't unified in this view. Some naval officers warned that provoking the United States would be a strategic disaster. They understood what Germany faced on the Eastern Front and knew the last thing Germany needed was another industrial powerhouse joining the fight. But their warnings rarely reached the top. Hitler listened only to the people who confirmed his worldview. Meanwhile, in America, public opinion shifted slowly but noticeably. At first, many saw the Atlantic confrontations as distant incidents, unfortunate but avoidable. But repeated attacks changed that. Newspapers printed stories of sailors lost at sea. Families grieved sons who never came home. The idea that Germany was an unavoidable threat began to sink in. Lend-Lease further deepened the rift. American factories churned out weapons, vehicles, and supplies for Britain and later the Soviet Union. To Germany, this was economic warfare. To America, it was a moral obligation to support nations resisting aggression while still staying out of combat. But the line between support and participation grew thinner every month. The intelligence war added another layer. American cryptographers monitored German communications. German spies attempted to gather information across Latin America. Each side watched the other with suspicion, interpreting every action through a lens of rising hostility. It was a cold rivalry turning slowly warm. There was also an ideological dimension. At its core, Nazi Germany viewed democratic America with contempt. To Hitler, the U.S. was a mix of ethnic groups, political factions, and capitalist interests that could never match the unity he claimed Germany possessed. He assumed that America lacked the discipline for prolonged conflict. This assumption would become one of his fatal errors. Roosevelt, for his part, believed that Hitler's ambitions could not be contained indefinitely. He famously compared helping the Allies to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. The fire, he warned, was spreading. And if Britain fell, the flames would reach America eventually. His message was clear: better to act early than to wait too long. Still, Roosevelt avoided pushing the nation into war prematurely. He knew the emotional and political cost of such a decision. Instead, he prepared the military, expanded production, and waited, hoping that Germany would not force his hand. But in the background, momentum was building. How long can two nations shadowbox before one finally lands a punch? The answer came not from Berlin or Washington, but from Tokyo. Japan's ambitions in the Pacific would eventually trigger events that shattered any remaining illusion of distance. Yet before that moment, the United States and Nazi Germany already stood just a single spark away from open conflict. By late 1941, the undeclared war in the Atlantic was well underway. German U-boats targeted ships with increasing confidence. American destroyers responded with greater aggression. Radio operators on both sides heard the tension shift in the tone of each transmitted message. War was no longer a possibility, it was an expectation. Diplomats attempted to calm the waters, but their words carried less weight with each passing month. Trust had evaporated. Both nations now viewed the other not as a neutral party or potential partner, but as a looming adversary whose intentions could no longer be ignored. This chapter ends on a critical realization. Before Pearl Harbor, before the formal declarations of war, the United States and Nazi Germany were already locked in a confrontation shaped by ideology, fear, and strategic necessity. They were enemies in all but name. And when the spark finally came, it didn't create the tension. It merely exposed the truth that had been building all along. On the morning of December 7, 1941, America believed it was still a nation at peace. In Hawaii, the sun rose over quiet naval decks and the hum of weekend routines. Sailors wrote letters home, pilots prepared for training flights. No one imagined that within minutes, the sky would erupt in fire and metal. Pearl Harbor was about to become the moment that changed everything. When the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over Oahu, confusion rippled across the base. Some thought it was a drill. Others assumed they were American planes returning from patrol. But the illusion shattered as bombs fell and torpedoes streaked through the harbor. Battleships erupted in flames. Columns of smoke curled into the sky. In less than 2 hours, the Pacific Fleet was devastated. The attack stunned the American public. Radio broadcasts struggled to describe the destruction. Families gathered around living rooms, listening in disbelief as reporters announced the rising death toll. America had been struck on its own soil suddenly, violently, and without warning. A microhook emerges. How would a nation known for hesitation respond when forced into a war it tried so hard to avoid? President Roosevelt addressed Congress the next day, calling December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. His words galvanized the nation. Isolationism collapsed overnight. Factories accelerated production. Young men enlisted in staggering numbers. America had awakened, not gradually, but instantly. But while the country mobilized against Japan, Hitler watched the unfolding events with a very different interpretation. Inside the Reich Chancellery, news of the attack was met not with fear, but exhilaration. Hitler believed Pearl Harbor was a strategic gift. In his view, Japan had just forced the United States into a two-ocean war, splitting its strength and distracting it from Europe. He assumed that America, overwhelmed by Japan, would have little energy left to challenge Germany. But this interpretation revealed how deeply Hitler misunderstood American resolve. He believed the United States lacked unity, that its population could not sustain a prolonged conflict, and that the shock of Pearl Harbor would fracture morale. Instead, it united the country more powerfully than any political speech ever could. This fundamental misreading would shape every decision he made in the days ahead. Hitler also believed Japan's strike brought Germany closer to achieving global dominance. He assumed that Japan would soon attack the Soviet Union from the east, relieving pressure on German forces fighting brutal winter battles on the Eastern Front. This assumption had no basis in Japanese strategy, but Hitler clung to it because it fit his vision of an Axis triumphant. Meanwhile, Roosevelt and his advisors watched events cautiously. They were prepared for war with Japan, but uncertain whether Germany would escalate. Even after the attack, America did not declare war on Germany. The nation's focus remained squarely on the Pacific. For a brief moment, the European theater hung in a strange balance, one that Hitler was about to break. Crisis deepened as German U-boats intensified their activity in the Atlantic. Reports came in of merchant ships destroyed without warning, survivors adrift in freezing waters. Each attack pushed the United States closer to confrontation, but still fell short of triggering a formal declaration. Roosevelt remained deliberate, determined not to give Germany the justification it wanted. But inside Germany, the mood was triumphalist. Hitler believed America was already interfering too much in the war. To him, Pearl Harbor simply exposed American vulnerability. In secret meetings, he argued that confronting the United States now before its industrial might could fully mobilize was the only logical step. His generals were alarmed, but their objections carried little weight. The crisis rising from Pearl Harbor was not just military. It was psychological. Around the world, nations watched to see how America would respond. Would it retreat into fear? Or would it rise to meet the challenge? The answer became clear as millions of Americans rallied behind the war effort. Factories roared to life, shipyards filled with workers. The nation was transforming. Hitler underestimated this transformation. He saw Pearl Harbor as evidence that America was weak and unprepared. He failed to grasp that the same attack he celebrated was forging a level of unity and determination that would soon become his greatest obstacle. This miscalculation would lead directly to the decision that sealed Germany's fate. If Pearl Harbor awakened America, what did it awaken Germany to believe? Tension reached a breaking point in the days after the attack. Neutrality in the Atlantic was collapsing. Diplomats scrambled to assess the consequences. Intelligence networks buzzed with speculation. The world sensed that the conflict was about to expand, but no one expected how quickly the next domino would fall. On December 11th, 4 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler made his move. In a speech filled with anger, pride, and misjudgment, he declared war on the United States. It was a decision that shocked the world and baffled even some members of his inner circle. Germany had just taken on a nation capable of producing more war material than all the Axis powers combined. But to Hitler, the moment felt inevitable. He believed destiny favored the Axis. He believed America was already his enemy. And he believed that bold action would galvanize Germany's allies. Each belief was wrong. Each belief pushed Germany closer to destruction. As this chapter closes, we return to the central truth. Pearl Harbor did not just launch America into war. It reshaped Hitler's strategy, accelerating his most catastrophic decision. The crisis had risen far beyond the Pacific. It had now engulfed Europe, the Atlantic, and the global balance of power. And in the next chapter, we explore the turning point that stunned the world when Hitler chose to fight an enemy he did not truly understand. December 11, 1941 began like any other cold winter day in Berlin. But inside the Reich Chancellery, history was quietly aligning itself toward a decision that defied military logic. Adolf Hitler prepared to address the Reichstag, his mind already made up. 4 days had passed since Pearl Harbor, and though the world was still reeling from the shock, Hitler was ready to announce a move that would reshape the war's entire trajectory. The moment felt inevitable to him, even though no one had forced his hand. Germany had not been attacked by the United States. Roosevelt had not declared war on Germany. In fact, America was still prioritizing the Pacific. Yet Hitler approached the podium with fierce confidence, convinced that striking first made him appear strong. What occurred next stunned even those accustomed to his unpredictability. He declared that Germany was now at war with the United States. As the chamber erupted into orchestrated applause, many German officials exchanged uneasy glances. They understood the scale of what had just happened. Germany was already fighting Britain and the Soviet Union. Adding the United States, the world's largest industrial power, to that list seemed reckless. A microhook rises here. Why did Hitler embrace a war he had every reason to avoid? The answer lies partly in ideology. Hitler viewed Roosevelt as a personal adversary, a leader who embodied the democratic values he despised. He believed America was run by weak politicians and controlled by economic interests that would collapse under prolonged conflict. These assumptions were not based on intelligence. They were rooted in Hitler's worldview, a lens that distorted reality. Another factor was overconfidence. Germany had achieved rapid victories in Europe and seemed poised for dominance. Hitler believed that momentum was still on his side. Despite the harsh winter battles in the Soviet Union, in his mind, America's industrial strength was irrelevant if its spirit could be broken. He underestimated the nation's capacity to mobilize, unite, and outproduce its enemies. Yet perhaps the most striking reason behind his declaration was his faith in Japan. Hitler assumed that Japan would now attack the Soviet Union from the east, forcing Stalin into a two-front war. With the USSR crushed, Germany could turn its full attention to Britain and America. But Japan had no intention of marching into Siberia. Their priorities lay in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Hitler was betting on a partnership that existed only in his imagination. Inside Washington, Roosevelt reacted with a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief because Hitler had removed any political obstacle to entering the European war. Frustration because he knew that a conflict on two fronts would stretch American resources thin during the crucial early months. Still, Roosevelt wasted no time. He requested and received Congress's approval for war with Germany on the same day. For the American public, Hitler's declaration felt like confirmation of something many had suspected, that the fight against Japan was only part of a much larger struggle. Newspapers described Germany's move as a declaration of arrogance and a monumental miscalculation. Nation unified around a new understanding. This war would not be regional. It would be global. Military planners in the United States quickly revised their strategies. The Germany First approach became official policy. Despite the devastation of Pearl Harbor, American leaders believed defeating Hitler was the key to shaping the post-war world. Factories, shipyards, and research labs redirected efforts toward Europe. Hitler had triggered the full weight of American industry without gaining a single tactical advantage. Inside Germany, reactions were mixed. Some officers were horrified, recognizing the danger of provoking a powerhouse across the Atlantic. Others supported the move, believing that America was too distracted and unprepared to pose a serious threat. But the truth was emerging, slowly and quietly. Germany had misjudged its enemy. How could one speech, delivered in confidence, open the door to consequences that would eventually crush the Reich? This chapter highlights one of the war's most dramatic turning points. In choosing to declare war, Hitler transformed America from an uncertain observer into a determined participant. Instead of deterring the United States, he galvanized it. Instead of weakening Allied resolve, he strengthened it. It was a tactical error, a diplomatic failure, and a psychological misreading, all wrapped into one moment. It also deepened the unity of the Allied powers. Britain celebrated the news, finally certain that American support would extend beyond supplies and escort missions. The Soviet Union, struggling under the weight of Germany's winter offensive, welcomed any sign that pressure might soon shift. Hitler had unintentionally given his enemies a shared purpose. As historians reflect on the decision, they often compare it to a gambler doubling down with a losing hand. Hitler believed boldness could compensate for weakness, that decisive action could override strategic disadvantage. But this was not boldness, it was denial wrapped in bravado. And the stakes were too high for denial. From this point forward, Germany would face an enemy with limitless manufacturing potential, deep financial resources, and a population ready to fight. The U.S. could replace ships, planes, and tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. Hitler's decision had unleashed a rival unlike any he had faced before. In the months following the declaration, American involvement transformed the war. Convoys strengthened. Bombers flew longer distances. Troops prepared for overseas deployment. The weight of American power began to tilt the scales, not immediately, but inevitably. Time was now working against Germany. This chapter closes by emphasizing the magnitude of December 11th. It was the moment when a regional war became a true world war. It was the moment when Hitler's ambition collided with reality. And it was the moment when the tide of history began to turn, even if the world did not yet recognize it. The question that remains is simple. Once the door to global conflict was opened, how quickly would the consequences begin to accelerate? When the United States officially entered the war against Germany, something extraordinary began to stir across the nation. It was not just anger or patriotism, it was a vast industrial engine awakening from peacetime slumber. From New York to California, factories buzzed with new purpose. Overnight, car plants became tank plants, shipyards roared, airfields multiplied. America was transforming into the arsenal of democracy, exactly as Roosevelt had promised. Germany, however, struggled to grasp what this awakening meant. Hitler had long dismissed American production as unfocused, inefficient, or dependent on civilian comfort. He believed Germany, hardened by years of total mobilization, would outpace the United States in wartime manufacturing. This belief was not just wrong, it was catastrophic. Within months, American factories began producing more planes, tanks, and munitions than the Axis powers combined. Workers trained at record speed, including women entering industrial roles for the first time in vast numbers. Entire cities shifted their identity. Detroit became the engine of Allied armor. Los Angeles turned into an aircraft hub. And Pittsburgh steel fueled everything from warships to artillery rounds. Yet production was only part of the transformation. America also mobilized manpower with a determination that shocked its enemies. Millions enlisted. Millions more joined support roles. College campuses, sports arenas, and empty fields were converted into training centers. The United States was not just entering the war, it was preparing to overwhelm it. How does a nation underestimated by its adversary become the very force that defines the war's turning point? Across the Atlantic, Germany began feeling the pressure almost immediately. The Battle of the Atlantic shifted as American shipyards flooded the ocean with new destroyers, carriers, and escort vessels. U-boats, once predators, found themselves increasingly hunted. Radar, improved depth charges, and long-range patrol aircraft made the seas far more dangerous for Germany's submarine fleet. Meanwhile, American bombers joined British forces in striking deep inside the Reich. Industrial centers, Essen, Hamburg, Cologne became targets. Oil refineries, ball-bearing factories, rail hubs, and aircraft plants faced continuous assault. Germany suddenly faced a two-front logistical nightmare: produce enough weapons to fight the Soviet Union while also repairing the destruction raining down from the skies. On the ground, the United States launched its first major offensive in North Africa. Operation Torch brought American troops into direct confrontation with German forces. Though inexperienced at first, U.S. soldiers quickly adapted, learning the realities of mechanized warfare and desert combat. What began as cautious steps would soon evolve into a confident march across continents. In Berlin, Hitler struggled to reconcile his expectations with unfolding reality. He had assumed America's entry would slow Britain and weaken the Soviet Union. Instead, all three allies grew stronger. Germany was beginning to lose control of the momentum it once enjoyed. American innovation accelerated the shift. Radar, code-breaking, new aircraft designs, mass-produced landing craft, and logistical networks spanning oceans gave the Allies advantages Germany could not counter. The U.S. military solved problems with speed and scale, turning setbacks into systems and systems into superiority. Germany still believed it could hold the line, but the line itself was cracking. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union, bolstered by American trucks, fuel, food, and machinery, mounted increasingly effective offensives. Supplies from the U.S. allowed Soviet forces to maneuver faster, strike harder, and sustain operations longer than before. Hitler had unintentionally strengthened the very enemy causing his army the most pain. By 1943, the impact of American production was undeniable. Thousands of tanks rolled off assembly lines. Fleets of bombers crossed the Atlantic weekly. A new generation of soldiers, trained and equipped, prepared for the next phase of operations. Germany, once the aggressor, was now reacting to forces it could no longer predict or outmatch. Inside the German high command, despair quietly replaced confidence. Generals understood what Hitler refused to admit. The United States had become the decisive factor in the war. Every month, American strength grew, while Germany's resources dwindled. Oil shortages crippled the Luftwaffe. Armored divisions waited for fuel that never arrived. Factories struggled to rebuild after bombings. And then came the strategic climax. The Allies prepared for an operation of unprecedented scale, an invasion of German-occupied Europe. The planning began months before D-Day, fueled by American industry and coordinated with British and Canadian forces. It was the inevitable consequence of Hitler's decision to bring the United States into the conflict. By mid-1944, Germany was surrounded by enemies advancing from west, east, and south. The nation that once believed itself unstoppable now faced the full weight of a mobilized world. And at the center of that weight stood American factories, soldiers, engineers, and commanders, proof that Hitler had awakened a giant he could never hope to control. As this chapter closes, one truth becomes unmistakable. Germany entered the war believing it could shape history through speed, surprise, and force. But once the United States fully entered the fight, the balance shifted permanently. Hitler's declaration had transformed the conflict from a gamble into a guarantee of defeat. The war's outcome was no longer in question, only the path and the price that lay ahead. By the time 1944 arrived, the consequences of Hitler's declaration of war on the United States were no longer abstract, they were visible. Across every front where German soldiers fought and struggled to hold ground. The Reich, once expanding with unstoppable momentum, now found itself shrinking under the relentless pressure of Allied operations. What had begun as a bold political move had evolved into a strategic catastrophe. American factories continued to pour out weapons and machinery with a speed and consistency Germany simply couldn't match. With every passing month, the balance of power tilted further. The Luftwaffe struggled for fuel and spare parts. The Kriegsmarine lost control of the seas. German ground forces, stretched thin, watched as the skies above them filled with Allied aircraft that never seemed to run out. Inside Hitler's headquarters, delusion hardened into denial. Reports of American production were dismissed as exaggeration. Enemy advances were attributed to luck or betrayal. But even the most loyal officers could no longer ignore the truth. Hitler's choice to declare war on the United States had opened a door that Germany could never close again. A micro-hook emerges. How does a single decision become the hinge on which an entire war turns? The Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, delivered the most undeniable proof. American troops poured onto the shores of France backed by an armada of ships, tanks, aircraft, and logistical capacity that Germany could not stop. Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich collided with the harsh reality of overwhelming Allied force, much of it made possible by the nation he chose to provoke. As the Allies advanced from the west and the Soviet Union pressed from the east, Germany found itself trapped in a tightening vice. Town by town, mile by mile, the Reich collapsed inward. The once expanding empire was now desperately contracting. Resistance continued, but hope was fading quickly. In Berlin's bunkers, the leadership clung to fantasies. Hitler believed the Allies would fracture, that Roosevelt and Churchill would turn on Stalin, or that some miracle weapon would appear in time to change the war's outcome. But the world outside those concrete walls had moved on. The strategic momentum had shifted irreversibly. By early 1945, American troops crossed the Rhine. Soviet forces closed in on the capital, and German cities lay in ruins. Civilians suffered immense hardship. Soldiers fought in conditions that were increasingly hopeless. The decision made on December 11, 1941, had amplified every weakness and accelerated every failure. When Hitler took his own life in April 1945, the war in Europe was essentially over. Berlin fell shortly afterward. Germany surrendered unconditionally in May, and with that surrender came the full weight of history reflecting upon the choices that had led to such devastation. One decision, born from arrogance and miscalculation, had contributed to the downfall of an entire regime. The aftermath reshaped the world. The United States emerged as a global superpower. Europe began rebuilding under new political realities. Germany split into East and West, its future defined by the very forces Hitler had underestimated. And the war crimes trials at Nuremberg exposed the moral bankruptcy of the Nazi regime to the entire world. Hitler's declaration of war also left a legacy of hard lessons. It demonstrated how ideology can blind leaders to strategic reality. It showed how misjudgment, especially on a global scale, can destroy nations. And it revealed something deeper, that strength alone is not enough to win a war. Understanding your enemy is equally essential. The story of Hitler's mistake continues to fascinate historians because it highlights the thin line between confidence and disaster. Germany had opportunities to reassess, to rethink, to restrain. Instead, emotion and ego drove the decision. And once the war expanded, the United States' vast economic power and unified resolve sealed Germany's fate. As the dust settled, a new era began, one shaped by alliances, superpowers, and the lessons carved into the world by World War II. America's role in the conflict would define global politics for decades, setting the stage for the Cold War and the modern international order. This chapter ends where reflection meets consequence. Hitler believed he was controlling destiny when he declared war on the United States. In truth, he was surrendering control. The Reich's defeat was not immediate, but it was inevitable. And the legacy of that decision continues to echo through the corridors of history. If one mistake could doom a regime, how could one battle redefine the entire direction of a global war? And now, the next episode turns to a very different battlefield, one on the open seas, where the balance of power in the Pacific shifted in just a few days. The story continues with our next chapter, From Defeat to Victory, how the U.S. turned the tide at Midway.